All right, welcome to 100 Years of Venetian Patrician Women's Fashion, 1490 to 1590. It's actually going to be about 1610-ish that we're going to run out to. I'm Maestra Raffaella di Contino, and I'm co-presenting with the amazing Honorable Lady Vittoria di Carducci. We are going to be going through a bunch of portraits. So one thing you need to know right out of the gate about Venetian fashion at this time, we have extant accessories, but at this time, pre-1600s, we have no extant actual gowns for specifically Venetian. There are surviving gowns that are Florentine. I was actually blessed to be able to attend the 2008 Costume Colloquium in Florence. And through an interpreter, I was able to talk with the museum curator at the Costume Museum in Venice and ask her and verify if there are any extant gowns anywhere in the world, because I didn't know of any. And she was able to verify for me that there are not actually any extant gowns. The ones in Florence, the Medici gowns, and then also there were, the time I was there were also some gowns being restored in Pisa that they think may or may not have also belonged to Eleanor of Toledo. But of course, those are Florentine fashion, and Vittoria will go more into the differences and the importance of why each city-state has its own very distinct style and culture and rivalry. With that, I'm going to hand it over to the amazing lady, Honorable Lady Vittoria, to kick us off with our first image.
Jumping right into the middle of the 1490s, we have Two Venetian Ladies by Carducci. For a long time, this painting was assumed to be of two courtesans, simply due to their rather extreme to modernize mode of dress. They are, in fact, not courtesans. These are highly respectable and very bored housewives sitting on the roof of their palazzo. This is one of the best images of what I would consider middle of the road Venetian fashion for the 1490s. Looking in detail at the back gown, we can see that it is made from green velvet. She has a monstrous strand of pearls, but it is not technically a choker. Her body linen shows only here at the very edge, and it has a knife pleated style ruffle on it, which has some sort of gold work on it, which gives it a very stiff and uneven appearance. The body linen coming down through here is not excessive. This is not a gigantic piece of fabric squished in there. And if you look right here, you'll see a very tiny, very precise ruffle. This indicates that all of this was pleated down into, if not a cuff, it was pleated down into something that maintained the pleats just so. Up here, you'll see that she's wearing a full length from a very high waistline, gold apron, complete with what looks to be early lace or asymmetry across the bottom. It also gives us a fantastic view of the hem stiffening common at the time. This kind of method is also known in Florentine work, and it is called a doppia. I can't say that this is for sure the exact same kind of construction, but this is obviously a stiffened hem. I have used my actual trim as a method of stiffening a hem, and I've also done it from the inside of the gown where no trim showed at all. You'll notice that the actual hemline itself is bound in a padded look. It is not just turned under. Moving to the front gown, we have more cleavage. And if you look here, for many years, I thought this little sliver of white was her body linen over here. It is not. This gown has a center front slash that likely goes all the way down to the high waistline. She too has monstrous pearls going around the neckline of her gown, and the same sort of knife pleated gold worked edge. But hers is a flat band of fabric as opposed to the folded, what looks like ribbon here. And the pearls themselves do not have any of the hanging metal plaques. The sleeves are very important at this time frame because they are how you added the most individuality to your garment. In this time frame, they almost never matched either the undergown or any overgowns. They were almost always a different color or a pattern. These are cut with, if anyone is familiar with medieval tailoring, they're cut with the seam running down the back outside of the arm. But rather than sewing it closed, they've left it open along that area and have tied it. These actually have big chunky glass beads weighting down the edges. This is a very interesting thing here because it shows you that it's tied all the way back down here when most of us only do one up here. This is a flat sleeve. You can see here that there is no seam on the front to minimize any wrinkling when you lean forward. That pattern is perfectly flat. Again, you have the perfect tiny little pleats down here that would indicate some sort of cuffing or that this is attached, if not the actual pleats coming from this. Her necklace is a strand of silver links rather than pearls. Here we have the other end of the fashion spectrum. This lady hasn't bothered to bleach her hair, and in Venice, that is a statement. That's saying something. Most women in Venice would bleach their hair sitting on top of their palazzo. Bangs are period. She has more of the forelocks than either one of these ladies do. But there you have it. Bangs are period. She hasn't lightened her hair, and it's very long, and it doesn't really show any evidence of bleaching at the ends either. Her necklaces are mostly silver, and she has huge gray pearls. Her gown, the neckline of it, doesn't have any kind of ornamentation on it, and her body linen is just a flat line. What this indicates is that not every piece of body linen is made the same, even in this time frame. Body linen in the Italian city-states was fatta in casa, which means made at home. So your body linen would be completely individual. It did not have the homogenizing influence of a tailor's guild to make them all look identical. As tight as this gown is off the shoulder, a very slim piece of body linen would be possibly required just to keep from pressing the pleats into your skin. And on the other end of the fashion spectrum, we have Durer's Venetian lady. Fun fact, he used this costume study as a model for the Whore of Babylon in a later print, which kind of gives you an idea of what he thought of this particular style of Venetian clothing. She still has the cinnamon roll hairstyle, but hers is more obviously laced down, whereas the others were simply kind of gently taped, right there and right there. This one's under more pressure. She also has it surmounted by a jeweled fillet, which seems to match her necklace here, which probably large quartz crystal, some pearls. Her hair, she does indeed have the bangs and the forelocks, but there's less of them. Her body linen, in contrast to the one we just saw, does have a narrow knife pleated edge showing right there, and it is considerably longer in the arms than any of the others we've seen, pulled out rather haphazardly, especially here at the cuff. You'll notice that this is not cuffed at all. There's no edging. This is just the end of the sleeve. Her undergown is not perfectly smooth. It's gathered along the front, right in here, you can see them, and it has a slash in the middle exposing the body linen underneath. This may or may not be stayed to a solid lining underneath it, which would be supportive of the bust. No way of really knowing. I would hope it would be, but you never know. The only thing that may be holding up her bosom is that really tight belt, which would be really uncomfortable. The undergown shows down here in a pattern. It does not have any trim around it, but looking at the wide, thick folds down here, I'm going to suggest that this does have some sort of hem stiffening underneath it. You can see her chopine sticking out the bottom, giving you the proof that yes, for at least a while, chopines did show on the bottom and skirts were cut short enough to where when you wore your chopines, they were actually out of the mud. Her overgown is a different style than many. It is pleated in the front and pleated in the back, and it has a V in the front and a V in the back. It comes down so far that it on the arm that it actually results in a really teeny tiny short stumpy little upper arm sleeve. This is as decorated as they get. This has multiple rows of what look to be snip bias and beading on them, and they are tied with thin cords very closely. You see, they almost touch here. They touch here. They don't have large gaps in them. These here purport to be large buttons closing the front of the overgown. I don't know if that is true. That seems more like they would be pins because they are centered exactly across the seam. Did it again. Ah, don't get dizzy. Hang on. There we are. I think they're pins rather than buttons. You look at the overgown. This definitely has a train, and the hem is definitely bound and padded. I don't think there is an actual doppia up in here. I think any stiffening is going to come from that padded bottom. From this angle, you can see that the train, when picked up, doesn't even pull on the fabric on the side back whatsoever. All the length is right here. As it shows right here, this is a very similar style where you have the V in the back and you have a V train, and the fabric on the side back doesn't move at all. Over here, you can see a different version that has hanging sleeves, but also has the very narrow V train shape. Venetian trains are always V-shaped. V for Venice, that's the only thing I can think of. I don't know of any other reason, but they're not rounded, they're not squared off, they're always V-shaped. This image here from the meeting of the betrothed couple gives you in one image several different versions of overgowns. You have beading here. We've got a V-fronted overgown. This one is not pleated at all. This one is smooth. That one is smooth. This one is smooth. These are existing at the exact same time as the pleated styles. This one has a train and a bound padded hem. This one, bound padded hem. This overgown actually is a complete gown with short sleeves and just a split in the front. This one has the V and may or may not be open in the front. So there are very different styles of overgowns that you can wear. There's no reason to feel like a certain style was or was not done because there are many, many variations that can be done. This style of slashing is, at this particular time, as far as I can tell, peculiar to Venice. I call it Easter egg slashing. Obviously, that's a technical term. But this is not, this is body linen showing through here. This is not a inner lining. That's just body linen coming out. Lovely. Moving to the next decade, radical change very quickly. The hair has gotten very, very severe, very pulled back, very prim, very proper. Jewelry has gone from being multiple necklaces and of different lengths to one strand, hers, pearls with likely jet, possibly garnet. The structure of the bodice itself has also changed dramatically. Gone is the cleavage, gone are the shoulders. Now the neckline is very square, canting slightly inward towards the neck at the top and out towards the edge of the shoulder, giving you a triangular shoulder area. This area right here becomes very important in the next few years, as does this line right here. I find it very interesting that trim was applied here, but these are not openings, and in the future, they will be. If you look at the sleeve and the body linen, you'll notice that there's plenty of body linen showing here, but it's not puffed. It has extra length that's kind of wadded up in there, but it's not puffed. The sleeves up at the top are smooth. There's no pleating in. There's no obvious attempts to fit. It's just a smooth piece of fabric. In 1505, you can see that concurrently you have the rather severe, upright, tight to the neck style, transitioning to a softer, more rounded, more organic style. Same year, same artist, different clothing. This hair here is wrapped around the back of the head and at the crown, which is very important for Venetian hair. Almost always, Venetian hair is focused at the crown rather than right over the top of the head. There are a few exceptions, but normally if you're doing Venetian, you're going to want to put your hair at the very back of your head. Hers is tightly wrapped in a caul that has beading and embroidery on it. Hers is much softer, even though it is wrapped in a caul, but again, hugging the back of the head. Their jewelry, this one, is this looks like abalone shell, I think is the way you pronounce it, laced together with ribbon. It's very beautiful, and it makes a statement all by itself. Hers is a alternating between either pearls or enamel with bicorn glass beads. Fun fact here, these were meant to both be black. He didn't finish this one. You'll notice over here that the gown itself is red with black trim. This, I'm not sure what this is. It could be an overgown, but it's sheer because you can clearly see black transitioning to red. This could be a article of clothing from a Germanic admirer, because Durer was very involved in the Bavarian community in Venice. It could just be a sheer overgown. I don't know. If you look at this one, you'll also see that the neckline does cant in towards the neck, but the construction here is noticeably different, as is a more horizontal focus across the chest. Again, the sleeves aren't pleated at the top. They're just kind of wrapped around and tied loosely with ribbons, probably front and again at the back. This one is the only image I can find that shows more than just a bust. I do not know why the skirt is different. Please do not take this as proof that you can wear a different colored bodice and a skirt, because I can't tell you that's what that actually is. What it might be is an apron, similar to the all-encompassing gold one that we saw in the Carpaccio 1495, or it could be an overdress with a very low neckline. Here you finally see the shape of the actual sleeve. It is smooth fitting at the top, smooth fitting at the wrist, and then expands in a funnel shape around the actual elbow. There's the center front trim again. This one may actually be a center front closure, my image is too fuzzy to tell. Moving to the 1510s, here you see the horizontal focus right across the top. The square neckline is still there, but it is expanded and relaxed and is barely hugging the shoulders. Her hair has come down. It's softer, looser, and held gently in a caul that just barely brushes her shoulders. She has simple jewelry, very simple. Venice was at war intermittently through this entire time frame. So depending on the year, you might be one of the nobles who gets tapped to put a new unit out to sea, and you suddenly find your clothing budget restricted enormously. So what happened in this time frame was that the glorious, silks and velvets and figures and brocades became passé, and instead they used miles of simpler fabric. This piece here is either a straight of the grain piece, which has had the edges fringed, or it is something cut on the bias and then left to distress. You can see she's got a little bit of a partlet tucked in here, but it's really just a way to wear a piece of fancy fabric. It's not actually hiding anything. It's just proving to you that she can afford it. The sleeve heads, while the sleeves themselves are huge, the sleeve heads themselves are relatively small, only slightly pleated. This would indicate that these sleeves are gored in panel shape rather than a giant width pleated down to fit the top. The waist has dropped considerably. This one looks unnaturally long. It may not, it may be that just this part right here is covering up part of the pleats. I'm not sure. But belts have become sashes through this time frame. Again, going with the very soft, very unstructured look. This shows the same structure across the front. It still has the same neckline, but the structure of the sleeves is different. These are fully pleated in, indicating that this gown has full widths of fabric that are pleated down to the head, rather than being gored. This one gives us, finally, a side view. By the time these huge sleeves showed up, the Venetians immediately slapped a cuff on them. This is what we call a transitional style. And you can see here, it's got a cuff, but it's gigantic. It's not actually cuffing anything, but it is pleated in and pleated in. The trim here is not all in one with the color of the gown as La Nova. All the trim is green. It's the same fabric. The body linen you don't see here, but you do see it poofing out at the joins on the sleeve. I'm going to put a guess that this sleeve is approximately 60 to 70 inches around. I have one for this time frame that mine are 65 and they are way too narrow. So 60 inches around is a good guess for the body linen sleeves that are under that particular gown. This one shows us that she is indeed wearing 2 layers. Now, you don't necessarily see the underlayer up at the top. And this makes the issue of wearing the correct number of layers very difficult, because it is difficult to tell just by looking at the picture what those layers are. As a rule of thumb, in Renaissance Italy, especially in Venice, your body linen is for God. You don't take that off. Prostitutes charged extra to take theirs off. The second layer, which she's wearing here, is for your family. That has you dressed and street legal for at home. It is to be only seen by family members. If you leave the house, you need to put on a third layer. And at this time frame, most third layer gowns had a train on them that you then carried to keep it out of the mud. If this young lady is wearing her chopines, then that tells us that the gown she's wearing is another full gown and can be worn under another full gown. If she's not wearing chopines and that little sliver of fabric showing there at the bottom belongs to a shorter gown, then that would indicate that a separate class of gowns, petticoat style gowns, has evolved. I don't know if that is the case, but in either one, if you either way you decide to handle it would work. Here is a gown that could be one of those petticoat style gowns. This one, you can see that it has a center front opening. There's no privacy placket or anything like that underneath it. There's no stiffening in that area. It rumples and crumples and shows the white body linen underneath it. It's very casual. That is the hallmark of the teens, is everything is very casual. Look, mom, I'm a nymph. There are huge, vast amounts of fabric used, but they use it in such a way as to accent their own beauty rather than actually cover it. This body linen here is made out of something very, very fine and gathered very, very, very tightly. I believe it is attached to a band in back because it has a very clear demarcation line across. Titian is infamous for hinting at what the stitching might be through here, but not really giving you a clear picture of it. He was an early adopter of painting on canvas, and this resulted in a softer, looser style, which is beautiful to look at, but horrible to try to document from. If you look at her hair, you'll see that it shows evidence of sun bleaching. It's darkest at the crown and lightest at the ends. If you are attempting to do a Venetian persona and you need to get what I call stunt hair to fill in your own length, make sure you get some that is lighter in color than your own and warmer in color than your own. Because as dark hair or any hair bleaches, it is very yellow and red underneath it, which is why most of the women in Botticelli's paintings appeared to be redheads. This image here has all the sleeve styles you could want and imagine all in one. Here we have a seamed pumpkin style, caught on the edges, stuffed with body linen with a smocked or finely pleated cuff. Note that the body linen doesn't show here. It's all wadded up into this. Right here, you can see that she's got a pattern on the back of her gown, but not enough of it shows to tell if it's actually the same thing from there to there. Her gown does not open in the front. They all have very soft hairstyles, barely contained, barely done anything to them. They would braid little tiny bitty strips of hair right here and wrap them around the back of their head to keep their hair out of their face. And like this lady, they would often tuck little flowers right there. This gown too is not front opening. I'm assuming a side. I've seen no actual evidence of a true back closing at this time in Venice. She is wearing 1, 2, 3 sleeves. She's got one set that is attached either under or on the shoulder strap, and this set which is attached over the top. You can see here on the front of her gown that this is an example of slashing to reveal a lining fabric. This could be actual slashing with a lining underneath it, or that may be a slashed over gown with a full petticoat gown underneath it. The lady in the middle has yet a different construction method. Her gown opens right down the front. It's difficult to see in this image, but there is indeed a seam running right down the center. This little tiny V right here is the first inkling of the dominant aspect of the second half of Venice in this time frame, which is the V front gown. This is the first time I've seen it, and it's just from leaving one hook undone. Her sleeves are pleated in, gauged in up at the top, as opposed to being seamed here. They have several different methods of strap work, weaving, pleating, and fringing down here to make a very complicated looking sleeve using just the fabric itself. This is the epitome of if some is good, more is better. She too has 1, 2, 3 sets of sleeves on, and what sleeves they are. She's got a front opening gown on, which she has not bothered to close because, look, Mom, I'm a nymph. It's red on the outside and lined in the same blue as appears on the sleeves. You can just barely see the red outline of the shoulder strap right up there. Her hair, too, shows signs of bleaching and stunt hair. Her sleeves are of the gourd shape because they're just barely gathered at the top but have voluminous masses at the bottom. The upper structure of the blue sleeves is not evident, but here at the bottom you can see that they're gathered onto a band and they're free floating. There's got to be a lining in there somehow to keep these the shape that they are. These are likely tied all the way up in here, and these are an ingenious solution to not being able to use much in the way of trim. These are pieced out of red and white. This fabric here was pieced red and white, and then pin tucks were put into it on the straight of grain, and when they cut it out, they flipped it on the bias, so now it's all diamonds and it's on an angle. Looking at the sturdiness of that pin tucking, my gut is that this was a whip stitch over the top of the fold rather than a running stitch at the base of the fold. I have not done this experiment yet to see exactly how those were done. But here you can see evidence of raw edges, pinked in some fashion. And here, sticking out of all this, is yet more body linen. Hers is done in what you would call a gather pleat method. You would gather up your panels and then you would pleat them. So the pleats themselves are not flat. They show gathering along each one of them. This is one of the ways you can get the gigantic amounts that you need to fill out these clothes and get the neckline to the size you need it. This is from the end of the 1520s and shows a return to smaller dimensions. The hair, once again, is back up neat and tidy. That's a 2-strand fishtail braid. So we still don't have much in the way of jewelry at all. And the very interesting thing about this one is the body linen. Yes, it's exposed here, but look what else is exposed. Underneath this white are black lacing lines. If they weren't supposed to be seen, why would they be black? So there is a debate about what exactly is going on here. Is there a pair of bodies underneath that she's got laced on that these might be pinned to keep it up? Is that just a petticoat? What is going on? Again, this is not an experiment I've had a chance to do yet. But as you can see, there is exquisite pleat work around the neck of this outer piece, which appears to be sheer and laying over whatever is underneath it. The shoulder straps are still set on a very square, straight up and down line running across the outside of the breast, but in this case, she's got them just slipped off the shoulder. She also has the pleated in sleeve top, similar to the middle lady in the Three Sisters, but you can see that the dimension is beginning to recede and the puff is beginning to move back up the arm. This is not a decorative cuff. That is a glove she's got on over here. Notice she's got a girdle, but it is a rather hefty chain girdle. And it does not look like it is sewn to the dress at all. That ends the first section.
Wonderful. Hello, and we are back for the second half of the 100 Years of Venetian Patrician Women's Fashion. I am Raffaella di Contino, and I am here with Honorable Lady Vittoria di Carducci, who is about to tell you a little bit about one last piece of construction hypothesis on the last image from the first half of our class.
I left off one salient point about this particular image. If you remember earlier, I discussed about you need 3 layers to be street legal. You need your body linen, which is for God. You need a gown, which is for private in your home. And you need another layer to go outside. In this particular image, it doesn't look like she's got on 2 dresses. But if you look right up here, you see a little strip of cloth of gold sticking out. It's not mirrored on this side, it's not trim, and it is physically underneath this piece, which is the outer gown strap. My theory is that she's got on another gown underneath this, perhaps cut in that petticoat style that we hypothesized earlier, that is helping keep these monstrously big sleeves from falling off. These gowns tended to be rather high in the back, and wearing a gown underneath this, I have tried myself, and it helps. It does help to keep those up. But it does feel rather awkward wearing 2 complete dresses. But if you're looking at trying to do a 1520s Venetian persona, really consider all the layers involved, and that isn't easy to move in either. So with that point covered, moving on to the 1530s. Radical changes in construction. You can see that the neckline has gotten very low, very wide, and open. We now have a certifiable partlet that is coming down and covering the part of the chest. The body linen is still relatively exposed as a holdover from the 1520s. And you can see in this picture just how lovely that band of needlework is. And it appears to be set on top of the pleating below it. Now, here is something that I didn't notice until about 3 years ago, and it shook me. It did. It shook me. If you look very carefully here, you'll see that that wrinkle right there is the actual strap, shoulder strap of the gown. The partlets are worn out over the straps to give you the illusion that the sleeves are just hovering right there at the top of the shoulder, and they're cheating. So you see how far it sits out here? She doesn't have a partlet at all. This is a different style. Remember that center front V that showed up in the early 1520s? Now we have a full front opening gown. This here, the tie, is a feature common in the 1520s because different style necklines and bodices, such as this one and this one, were worn concurrently. So with a camisa like this, you could tie it tighter or leave an opening in order to fit different gowns. This one here, I believe, was a ribbon-tied gown. You can see disturbances in the shadows right here, right there, and right there. Um, my best guess is that this was a tied ribbon style gown. Interesting to note about this one. See how small the upper sleeve has gotten? It's literally just a little decorative capoof right at the very top. This is the most body linen you're going to see for a long time. This fabric and this fabric don't match. They're not the same thing. This is a damask and this is a velvet. The waistline has dropped down to I would call a low normal. And if you look right here, there's that line along the outside of the body, again, coming straight down from the shoulder strap that first showed up in 1500. It's still there. It may have something to do with where the pieces of the bodice were connected together, but I don't have a real reason for that piece of trim yet. If you look at the skirt in this time frame, it is heavily pleated. It is very full. Cartridge pleating is almost never used in Italy. Most of the time you see either knife pleats or, like this, box pleats that have a little bit of gathering put into them too. Here you'll see that the hair has retreated to very prim and proper dimensions, but if you look closely, you'll see that the braid in the back is much lighter and warmer than the hair up here. She's a natural redhead, so she doesn't necessarily even have to try to bleach her hair because red is a fugitive color to begin with in hair and tends to bleach itself just by wear and tear. Even in the 1530s, we still don't necessarily see earrings all the time, but pearl necklaces are becoming much more common and the choker length is becoming the preferred. Here we see another partlet, but this one is completely sheer, made out of possibly cloth of gold or silk. You can see that her shoulder straps are super narrow, way back over here, but they're covered. Even though you can see right through the fabric, the partlet is still worn all the way over it out to the edge. You can see the darker gold stripe where it's bound on the outer edge right there. This is likely a side lace gown, and these upper sleeve puffs are likely attached to the gown. These are probably not. Those are tied on. The 1530s is one of the last time frames where you have this much at the top of the sleeve, and this is one of the last times where you will ever see a contrasting upper and lower sleeve. By the 1540s, the waistline is permanently lowered and it's beginning to bend. I wouldn't call it necessarily a point yet, but is a rather barrel-chested and long, low, masculine kind of line. The upper sleeves have shrunk even further, and the gap that used to be here where body linen showed is now gone. This part of the sleeve and this part of the sleeve are now usually one part. This and this come off together rather than the upper part sticking to the gown and the lower sleeve being tied in. The sleeves here are a little bit looser than they have been, but you can see here that the shoulder straps are pretty much squared up. They're still on top of the shoulder because the shoulder strap, you can see the darker right there on either side, it's still pretty much on the shoulder. This is the decade where the shoulder straps begin to fall off the shoulder completely and become just bands at the top of the arm where you attach your sleeve. Note here, she has two partlets. This one is to protect this one from her. This is gold work, and between it and her matching cap, that is an amazing amount of money. And the body linen underneath it is protecting the investment here from the skin oils. If you look here, you'll see that it is a ruffle, but it is not a precise, perfectly starched ruffle. And this is most likely not an attached ruffle. This is just her sleeve coming out at the end. If you look over here, you'll see that there's a couple spots where it doesn't even show at all. Now we see a definitive point. This is the middle of the 1540s, and the bodice has become longer, stiffer, more formal as the point goes down. The sleeves still retain the little puffy thing up at the top, but if you notice, the actual sleeve itself is much softer and easier to move in. She also has perfectly arranged pleats around the bottom, which would indicate that she has some sort of a cuff inside this. Her partlet is done, it is opaque and done in a beautiful striped fabric, again, worn completely over the shoulder straps themselves, which are still up on the shoulder. There's a possibility, due to this seam right here, darn it, that the sleeve itself, the bodice, is pinned to this in an effort to help keep it in place. This gown is one of the first examples of the ladder lacing in the front, but you notice that the gap is very, very, very narrow. Sometimes the get from about here down, they will actually close at this point. It is not always present, and uh, side lacing gowns are still common, but becoming less common as the decade progresses. If you look up here, you'll see that her hair, as usual, is back at the crown of the head, and the braids are of a lighter and warmer color than the other hair at her at the roots. She's a natural blonde, so the effect isn't nearly as obvious. She finally does have earrings, and there is what Mistress Raffaella refers to as the issued at birth pearls. It is true, in paintings you will see little girls of ages 3 and 4 wearing pearls just like their moms. Here we see an example of lace. This is the beginning in Venetian fashion of the lace craze, and that's the only way to describe it. In 20 more years, there will be lace everywhere. This entire partlet is made from reticella and represents a vast investment. It too has something underneath it to protect it from her. And quite clearly, you can see that it's worn out over the straps. This gown also gives you an excellent perspective on how this was made. This strap comes from practically underneath the arm. It does not come from out here and up over the shoulder like we would think like a modern brassiere would to support and lift the ladies. This strap has nothing to do with bosom support. The bodices by this time are sufficiently stiff enough that the bosom is supported from beneath, and this strap literally just exists to put your sleeve onto. This part here is attached to the shoulder strap, and you can just see the tiniest bit of body linen right there, indicating that this part is where the sleeve starts. These are often laced in rather than tied um, in a pretty symmetrical way all the way around. That way there aren't any gaps to show here. Again, the sleeves in the 1540s were softer in width, which has the effect of making the midriff look even smaller and daintier. Again, you have a very full, heavily pleated skirt, and you can see that the opening for this continues down into the skirt, and there is no modesty panel over that to hide the fact that it is open there. It doesn't seem to be a concern. You can see her body linen is not stiffly starched and pressed and pleated at the edge, indicating that, again, this is just a sleeve underneath it that is poking out the bottom. And this one has a unique feature. It has a rolled bit of trim right at the end that matches this up here. This is very uncommon in Venetian sleeves. Most of the time, sleeve ends are very plain until later when sometimes lace gets applied. You see, she does have a girdle that hangs off to the side, but it is not the kind of girdle that we would normally think of when we think late Renaissance girdles. It is just hollow gold puffballs, basically. Here you can see the very beginnings of the Venetian horns in the future. What happens is the fullness in the front begins to split to the side, and focus begins to end up here on the temples. In time, this will become a solid roll, but the height will still be out here at the temples. By the 1550s, you can see that gowns themselves have become simpler. They aren't necessarily as trimmed. They aren't as ornate, but significant variation exists. Now, with the influence of Eleanor de Toledo, the coat becomes the outer garment. Whereas before, even up into the 1530s, your outer garment could be another dress that looked just like the dress you had underneath it. Now, almost everyone switches over to we have a simple gown with sleeves that you can actually put other sleeves on top of because they're thin enough. And this becomes the accepted I'm out of the house look. Her partlet has some beautiful gold work on it. If you notice, baby girl has a necklace just like mama, but this one also has coral in it. An interesting thing to note here, you don't really see mom's body linen, but look at the precise detailing right there. Also look at the strip of gold trim that comes down the top of her arm. That tells me that this particular sleeve has been enlarged. Look at the band of trim at the bottom. I think this gown has been retrofitted to keep fitting a growing little girl who looks just like her mama. This gown is labeled as 1550, but I think it's a little bit later than 1550. It's probably mid 1550s. I say this because look at the points on these gowns. These are not peak point, we'll see that in a little bit, but these are definitely a sharper point than the point you see at the beginning of the decade with the Countess in the prior slide. You can see that the neckline is coming down even further in the bodices. We're still roughly at the nipple line, possibly slightly above. This is the time frame when lace begins to be appliqued to the outside. This is not attached to the body linen. You would not attach this kind of lace to the body linen because you don't want to wash this all the time. You can take it off and spot clean it if you have to, but you don't want to launder this the way you would body linen. And you can see here that there's hardly anything showing at all. But again, there's variation. Here's an important note. When you go outside and you're Venetian, you need to be wearing some sort of a head covering. It isn't necessarily something that covers your hair and is attached to your hair. You need to wear some sort of a veil. Before the 1550s, when the coats came into vogue, this was supplied by a mantello, which was literally a descendant of the Roman palla. It's a piece of fabric full width by anywhere from 3 to 4 yards long that you just slung around you. And when you went outside, you just flipped a loop up over your head and ta-da, street legal. That doesn't work anymore. So now veils become part of the exterior wardrobe. You can see here that collars begin to show up and become important to the actual gowns, and you can see that the partlets are still worn all the way out to the edge covering the actual shoulder strap. This creates a problem right here in the front that I have yet to quite figure out. I've tried a couple options and they aren't really acceptable. What happens is the partlet is diving underneath the gown until it gets to the sleeve head, where it then has to sit on top of something. So it's going from under to over, but it still has to look like it's under. I would love to see folks tackle this particular problem and post results so maybe I can get my friend dressed, because right now I still can't get that far. Here we see a very important detail of Venetian fashion, and that is the back V point. I don't know if it was 100% across the board, every gown had a back point, but by far, if the gown has a point in front, it will have a point in back. You can tell that the sleeves have gotten completely simple. There's very little kind of detail. It's simply slashed at the top. This is a very, very simple style. When you left the house, this would be covered by a much more elaborate coat. Note this. This is very unusual in Venice. It's lovely, and I want one myself. But this particular style, where it is directly up over the top of the head with a center interest, is more Florentine. So if you do Florentine, something like this would be perfect. This is the glaring exception to every single thing I've said about the 1550s. And this just goes to show you that, at least in Venice, there are truly no hard and fast rules. There are generalizations, but in a city like Venice, which had more money than sense at times, sometimes anything will go, such as this dress. This has everything you can possibly do to a dress. It has tabs at the wrist, very unusual. It has structured pleats, indicating that there's a cuff underneath it. It has scalloped shoulder tabs. It has cording. It has puffing. It has embroidery. It has this here is very important to note, actually. This little guy right here going all the way across, that to me indicates a corset. Were it just a placard here to fill in the V, which is a very common thing, why would it then show all the way across? It would make sense, given how firm and structured bodices are becoming, that she might have a corset. That is a valid way to handle later period Venetian clothing. You can either bone the bodice, or you can do a pair of stays and then do the gown over that. I would say either one is acceptable, because in any given time frame, any given decade, you will see some gowns that are very rigid and obviously straight up and down bone, and others that curve along the front. So I think either way is acceptable, and it just comes down to, is there a certain gown you want to replicate, and are you comfortable wearing something that stiff? Her partlet in particular is of interest because it literally has raised appliques and puffing and butterflies and all the things you could possibly want on a partlet. And it is covering up the strap right there on the edges. She has her required pearl necklace and an amazingly long one that is pinned to the front of her gown. Notice that her cording, her ladder lacing, matches the dress. It's not all black. I've seen dark green, I've seen red, white, silver, and of course, black. Don't feel limited to black when you're doing a gown. Go for what blends. If you look at the hair, you'll see that the center part is gone, but now all the hair up here is starting to be rolled and manipulated. It's shorter, but now it's not just, left to frizz. Now we're doing something with it. And the hair moves to the back in a bun. It's still at the crown of the head, but instead of being braids wrapped around, now it's a little bun. Here we have a lovely coat. This style with a very high collar is often referred to as a zamara. I would not be so brave as to say, yes, this is a zamara, but that is the type. This one has beautiful sleeve poofs over the top, indicating that the gown underneath it has very simple flat sleeves. Her cuffs are very neat and tidy and very thick, probably folded over fabric and attached to a cuff underneath. The buttons on both sides, again, is a Turkish influence design, as is the pattern on the fabric and the cut. Here you'll see that, again, the interest in her hairstyle is moving out to the temples, but her hair is still contained mostly in the center back in a bun up high near the crown. She has her pearls, and she has a giant, magnificent pendant here that hangs almost all the way down to the point of her gown, which has gotten rather extreme. This one is a very pure example of the turn of the 1550s to 1560s. It has a very stiff, long point. It has ladder lacing. It has body linen poking out here. It has a partlet wrapped around the back. It has very, 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 very thin shoulder strap, which is now completely off the shoulder. It has panes at the top. It has lace along the sleeve. And she has matching bracelets to go with her perfectly pleated ruffs. She has the Venetian Flag Fan. Now, I used to wonder why on earth are they so long until I sat down and tried to move my arm wearing a dress like this. You can't bring your arm up and forward, so you set your arm here on your lap and just wiggle your hand, and then the top of the fan goes back and forth up here. She has required pearls and matching pearl earrings, and her hair is up in a braided and pearled bun at the crown of the head. She has her hair frizzed slightly, again, puffier around the temples than the center. An important thing to note about the gowns in the 1560s is the shape of the skirts. If you look here, the gown is only slightly gathered and pleated at the top, and it's not very regular. It's done in a very organic manner. Skirt panels tend to become a little narrower at the top and wider at the bottom, giving you less bulk right up in this area, which plays up the fact that this long, narrow point comes down. And this whole area is very slim and very delicate looking, to go with the very slim and delicate sleeves. This one is the beginning of the wide openings. These are considerably difficult to make because you have to deal with the end of this right here. The way I'm dealing with it is I'm building the bodice as a corset, continuing down below where the skirt ends, and then I'm mounting the skirt onto the corset. So the skirt itself isn't flapping in the wind down here, it's actually mounted to a corset, and then this is laced up over it. In this time frame, late 1560s to 70s, it was often very common to have an embroidered or a different piece of fabric right here. She has just a plain white piece here. This is not pleated. This is not supposed to represent the gathers of her body linen. This is just a flat piece. And if you look down here, the points are getting so low that it's beginning to hang. This is a little bit of distance in between her body and the end of the point. Also, the edges along the hip are starting to raise just the tiniest of bit, again, to exaggerate just how long and deep these curves are. Sleeves are now 100% two-part and curved in order to keep the bulk and the wrinkles down. Almost everyone has very neat and tidy ruffles at the wrist and across the front. Almost everyone has a pearl choker, and almost everyone will have their hair up in a pearled bun in the back with interest here at the side fronts. This gown is unusual because it has a double layer of guarding along the front and along the sleeves. This is an unusual amount of decoration for a Venetian gown. More common is one guard along the neckline and nothing along the sleeves. This is a lovely gown, And as this lady is what we would consider plus size, the addition of the second guard plays tricks with the eye and actually makes her look smaller than she actually is. It's a very lovely way to handle body image issues. Here's an example of two different styles of gowns. Here's one that is super straight up and down. You can see it's literally, it looks like she's got rulers shoved in on either side. She has a girdle that's attached and hangs down. And the sleeves are very, very simple with a turned back lace cuff. She has a sheer partlet with a tiny little collar, while her friend over here isn't even wearing sleeves. This tells you that they are in a private home, even though there's a man present and babies, dogs. This is at home. Her front opening gown has a very narrow aperture, which is unusual for this time frame, but perfectly acceptable. Her gown seems far less stiff than this one does, indicating that this might be a simpler style of gown than this one is. She has a partlet too, but it does not seem to have a collar. This one is much simpler. I'm not sure what is going on with the hair here. I will be quite honest. I've never seen that before, and you never see it again. I don't know if she's actually got her hair up in rollers or if that is little bows. I'm not sure. I don't know. I would love to see someone try this and wear it and see how it goes. I really would. But note, even though she has this very casual looking outfit on, she still has her pearls. That means she's still a lady. Here we see a closed front in the 1560s. And at this time frame, very slight amounts of peascodding begin to creep their way into Venetian bodices. Instead of being flat to slightly concave down the front, they start to bulge outward a little bit in imitation of men's military styles. You can see again that the sleeves are long, very simple. There's very little embroidery or detailing along the cuffs. They're just simple, white, very tidy pleats. She has two chain girdles coming down, and her partlet is of gold. It also covers up much more of her chest, and her neckline is much higher than normal, showing again that there are no hard and fast rules. Even if you're not comfortable displaying the amount of cleavage people would in this time frame, that doesn't matter. You can wear a higher neckline. It's period. She has a lovely coat on, again, with the shoulder puffs. That my friend Raffaella actually has one that looks very much like this. These may or may not be lined in fur. Sometimes they don't seem to be. This one does not seem to be, whereas the one in the 1560s of the Countess Porto was entirely lined in fur. This gown is pushing the 1570s. It is very unusual in several respects. One, it has striped sleeves. This is a two-part sleeve, if not more, because they are very snug. And while they are very wrinkled, they don't have large wrinkles. It's very fitted. Two, it has a very, very wide opening, but there's no embroidery or anything like that here. This is a flat white piece that is put over body linen. Her partlet is rather simple, but it has a beautiful collar on it. And the most interesting thing is the fact that it has a split front. There are very, very few examples of split fronts in Venice, this one being one of the most obvious of them. The other is the Titian's Lady in White, which has her center front slit closed with tiny little buttons. This appears to be embroidery done on either the fabric itself, judging by these creases here, or done on a very thin piece of silk, which is then appliqued. It really does look like it was done directly on. Again, a very unusual thing to do, because most of the time trim like this was put on, was done on a separate piece of fabric and then applied to the garment. And when the garment itself wore out, they would pull this off and then apply it to a different piece. This is where your money is. So for it to be done directly on a skirt like that would be very unusual indeed. We also have placement of trim here, which is not common to Venice. There's that straight up and down the side again, 30 years later, but now it forms a triangle over here. This triangle effect begins to show up more and more in Venice up into the 1590s. And again, the shoulder strap starts way over here and just literally wraps around the top of the arm. It's doing nothing to support the actual body. All of that is coming from the bodice itself. Here we have, finally, in 1570, the first hint of the famous Venetian horn hairdo. Likely this is done with a shorter front hair that is rolled up over a rat. A rat is just a false piece that you can use to fluff out hair. It can be anything from a sock to hair you've pulled out of your own comb to actual false hair. Anything that will hide into your hair and not cause you pain will work. She has earrings on, though they're hard to see. She has the required pearl necklace. Her partlet is now mostly sheer again, and now, in contrast to the 1550s when they were so elaborately decorated, now it's really just these front edges that are decorated, and then the focus is on the collar that goes around the back. That's where the expense is with the lace. This gown has a very wide center front opening that she has applied a different fabric into. My guess is that this is embroidered, possibly beaded. It's very difficult to tell, but I do think you can actually see lacing lines on it. It also has trim coming down along the sides all the way around it, and again, that's a little unusual. The sleeves are very simple. Note that this one isn't cut. This one is not cut into a two-part sleeve. This one is left straight to show the pattern. That is a very Venetian thing to do. If you have a glorious giant pattern like this, Venetians would cheerfully not have the perfect fit and vote for letting the fabric speak for itself. While she does have plenty going on, the real star of the gown is the fabric, and that is also indicated in the fact that the sleeves are not fitted as well as they normally would be. This gown is an example of a color called cochina red. This house, this is a painting of the Madonna of the Cochina, right? This color red was kind of their trademark, and to wear it was a sign that you were one of the hip folks in Venice at the time. And sometimes it is rumored that you had to be nice to the cochinas in order to be able to wear this color. This gown has a train in the back. I can't tell if it's pointed from this angle, but every train I have seen is pointed. Here is that odd little triangle again, showing up in stitching lines. This may be a very solid piece of boning, similar to here, but I don't know exactly what it is. But this triangle, again, starts showing up more and more. The tops of the sleeves, very, very simple. Hers are paned It's not 1 or 2 pieces. This is 5 or 6, very carefully fitted to her arm. But the panes up here do not extend straight up. This is not a slash method. The sleeve itself ends here, and then it has panes at the top, which are gapped slightly. They don't quite meet at the bottom. The shoulder strap is literally just a decorative bit of fluff up here to hide the sleeve join, and that's it. Again, it does nothing at all to support the bust. Again, we have an example of a wide opening front with just something simple and white behind it. There are debates as to, is that a stiffened piece of fabric? Is that the front of a corset? Either way, perhaps. Wearing a corset with a gown like this makes a lot of sense. It will help take pressure off of expensive fabric. And I personally find them a little more comfortable than trying to wear a very heavily boned gown without any support continuing down onto the hips. An important thing to note is that in the 1570s, the hip line, which in the 1560s was nice, gored, and slim, has begun to be puffed. I don't know if it is anything more than padding out pleats or a petticoat underneath it, but this area in the 1570s begins to expand quite a bit. Note, if you will, that the hair is still on the back of the head, and there is still some interest here on the sides, but even this it girl wearing the Contino red doesn't have horns. Again, not everything in Venice is completely regular. You can wear your hair high, you can wear your hair low. You can wear a high neckline, you can wear a low neckline. Things to remember is that Venetians like to let the fabric speak for itself, and they tend to prefer very small, very dainty upper arms past 1530. See what I mean? Completely opposite of letting the fabric speak for itself and dainty, petite. Nope. This is a peascod style bodice with a very high rise on the hip. Her hips are probably right about there, but the bodice comes up higher, again to accentuate this long V shape, which always continues right up into the armpit and then all the way up and around. Her partlet at this point is nothing but lace. There are no shoulder puffs to speak of, except lace. Lace ruffs at the shoulders now often end up replacing the little puffs of linen and silk that used to be there. She now has an immense collar of lace behind her head. This may be separate from the actual partlet. It would make sense if it were two different pieces that could be put on different gowns together. Hang on, cat help. And this is something very, very interesting right up here. This is not her hair. This is a metal frame made of welded rings. If you look very carefully, you'll see that some of them are flat, going this direction, and some of them are going this way. Her own hair is looped into it, but the horns everyone thinks is hair is actually a metal frame in this case. Down here, you can see that she has yet even more lace, even though you can barely even see it against the fabric. It almost matches this, but not quite. The actual body linen underneath seems to be a flat band. There's a possibility this would be attached to the body linen, but I really don't think it would make sense. Here we have a middle ground. This one isn't too horribly deep, but notice how low the bodice is getting. Here again, there's that angular line from underneath the arm down to the point, which then follows up into the arm and then up and around. Her partlet I believe to be opaque because this is cut almost below the bosom. Uh, the edge of the partlet itself ends right about there, and this is set just to the inside of it. She actually has horns of her own hair. There's a very, very defined difference between the look of this and the frame. Oops, see? I do think that the standing collars were a separate piece. It would make sense. Again, lace has replaced the slashing and poofing at the very top of the sleeves. The sleeves are now clearly pieced with the seam lines accentuated. Again, there is poofiness around the top of the hip. There's definitely some sort of padding, perhaps a bum roll of some sort underneath it. This one demonstrates the peascod shape in addition to the new being cut below the bosom. This is one of my friend Raffaella's favorite portraits because it shows a very casual, very romantic version of Veronica Franco. Her hair is curly and short, and it is curled up around her head in the heart shape, which is really what most people end up with instead of horns. This is actually a very, very common shape to the hair in late period Venice. Here you can see that her makeup is rather natural, but she does have blusher and she does have red lips. Her earrings are little bows, which are very common. She wears her required pearls. But here, this is very unusual. At this time, most gowns have hardly any strap at all. This one has a very wide strap, and not only that, it's cut in one with the body, and it's decorated and pearled. This might indicate that this is a kind of at-home gown. Veronica Franco was a very famous courtesan. Maybe this is something that she entertained in private, uh, but is more than just a petticoat. You can see over on her shoulder here that this is embroidered net and very costly. The whole effect is very lush and very soft. And this is new. Venice has been very neat and very tidy and very precise for a long time. We haven't seen this level of softness and romanticism since the 1520s. Here we are at peak point. This is one of the most extreme examples of long bodices that I have been able to find. She literally cannot sit with her legs together because the point comes down and probably hits the chair. Again, her sleeves are very, very simple with the upper puff replaced by lace. She has a very stiff and pronounced collar that goes up and around. That one may actually connect down here. Her bodice is actually cut just below the nipple line and is ladder laced, though here it looks like, again, this is just a flat piece of fabric. Her pearls are huge. She has her hair tied in the bun in the back, and she has a frame assisted horn hairdo along with earrings. If you look down at her hem, you can see that the large bands of trim that used to be common are gone, replaced by several that are short. Not short, thin and elegant. There's much more flow to the bottom of these skirts as opposed to the 1520s. Here we see an example of the flow. She's clearly wearing an undergown, which has bands of trim at the bottom. It seems to be stiffer and more full than the gown she's wearing over the top of it, which would make sense. Often, petticoat layers were used as an alternative to making the outer gown stiff and heavy at the hem. The petticoat does the job of keeping it away from your feet, allowing you to stand and move without tripping over yourself. Again, this point is so deep that sitting would be difficult. This gown not only has the cut under the bust, it has a peascod and the long point. Her shoulder ruffs are now nothing but lace, and the lace collar comes clearly down to attach to here, whereas before they arced around the back of the shoulders. Now they're attached all the way down here. She's wearing a frame with her hair woven through it, and the rest of her hair is gathered at the back, center back now instead of at the crown, finishing off her hairdo. She has lace here, but the rest of her gown is exquisitely simple. The drama is now all in the lace, and that's very common until the 1590s. Here at the beginning of 1580, the bodice, as we can see quite clearly here, is now normally cut at the nipple level or below. Bodices have lost some of the extreme length and some of the softness is beginning to turn. In this image, you can see there's a little bit of concavity below the chest, which suggests that this is not the extremely ruler straight type of gown from the 1560s. The sleeves are beginning to loosen and soften again, and the extremely high collars are beginning to soften and relax and become more of what one would call a falling band style collar. Everyone, however, including the baby, has their pearls on, pearls issued at birth. If you'll note, the hair has also changed. What was before gathered into a rather strict bun at the back has turned into various coils gathered along, pinned along the sides of the head, and in a softer, more organic shape at the back of the head. Again, the focus here is on the lace. She actually does have fabric here, but look at this. She has lace all the way down the front and back up. The rest of the gown is exquisitely simple, letting most of the fabric speak, except right here along the edge is what looks to be an embroidered in place band, which then makes one wonder, is the whole thing embroidered? And if it is, that is an amazing amount of money. She, underneath her gown here, has just the plain, but if you'll notice, her ladder lacing is a little bit crooked. It's not quite perfectly spaced. And the fabric underneath it isn't quite flat, but it isn't quite pleated either. It's just kind of wandering around underneath it. This might indicate that the gown itself is boned and it's worn over just the body linen. Here we have falling band style collars. We finally have a little bit of sleeve puff back at the head. We have a two-part curved sleeve with very neat figure eight style pleats. We have standardized pearl necklaces. We have a no frame horned style hair. This I would call a true horn. This does not have the frame attached, and this is made probably with her hair rolled over rats. Here you can see, sticking out of the back, is that back point, which still is a feature on most Venetian gowns. The gown itself is very fluid and very soft. There isn't a lot of hem stiffening or padding going on. Here we have another closed front. Again, not all Venetian gowns are open front ladder laced. This one is a peascod. Again, very, very deep in the point, making her sit with her legs apart. But on this one, the fabric is definitely the star of the show. That and the lace. The amount of lace she has on this gown is truly staggering. She's got two kinds, this one here and then this. These are not the same entity. They almost look like they are, but they're definitely two different things. She does have a frame in her hair. You can see that the rings are back here, and her hair is woven and supported into them. So this is a hybrid of wearing a frame versus wearing your own curls. Other important thing to notice about this one is the depth of the pleats around the top of the gown. They've gotten very heavy and very thick again, as in comparison to the 1560s when there was hardly any gathering at the top. Here we have another closed front on a lady of more modern proportions, we might say. Notice that the bodice is now cut completely underneath the breasts. Her partlet, which appears to be lace, is over another piece of fabric in order to keep things, shall we say, contained. The pattern on this fabric is beautiful and is centered perfectly on the front. However, it is not on the sleeve. The sleeve also, very interestingly, has a lovely set of buttons coming up from the cuff. This is very unusual. Most sleeves in Venice are very simple. This is definitely a falling band style collar that may be separate from the actual partlet. It may be part of it. This now is evidence of the very loose figure eight style pleating that became popular later in the decades. She is also wearing a frame, but it's not a very obvious frame. And she has her own hair curled into it as well. The rest of her hair is pulled to the back and taped into a bun, as it normally is. The other thing about this portrait that I like so much is her posture. She's very confident, she's very relaxed, she's very comfortable in herself. And I think that's one of the things that's lovely about Venetian clothing. It does not truly care what size you are, what your body shape is. There's a style that will work for you that you can feel like a queen in. By the time we get to the 1590s, styles in Venice have gotten very divergent. One is a throwback to earlier styles where things are much simpler, much more close to the body, much more natural feeling, with one tiny difference. They are cut completely underneath the bosom, and the partlet now functions as the upper part of the bodice. The partlet itself, you can see, comes down at least here because it sticks out of the side of the gown itself. This is pleated fabric, but there's another layer underneath this, which may be her actual body linen, and this may be a piece put over it. She has her standard pearls. She's got her hair taped to the back of her head, and in the front, rather than a frame and horns, she just has a very soft heart-shaped roll that dies behind the ear. The partlet comes all the way off the shoulder now, and the shoulder strap that used to have all the lace and all the puffing is basically gone. At this point in time, it is my theory that this style of shoulderless gown began to have the sleeves themselves sewn to the partlet. Otherwise, you can't really tell how deep the point goes on this one, but it is very wide, which would indicate that it has a relatively deep point. Here we have the shortening bodice with the even stiffer collar around the back of the head. This is the Doloresa, which explains why she has the cloak and that particular little pointy hat. Those are reserved to the Doge and the Doloresa. Again, this is cut completely beneath the bosom, and the partlet actually is forming the upper half of the bodice. Hers is rather simple. It's not covered in lace. Even her collar is not covered in lace. This is all about that cloth of gold. This gown itself would have cost astronomical sums just based on the fabric. Again, you can see that the pleats at the top are very deep and full, but there's something supporting them. These are not just yanking down straight. There's something underneath these to keep them full. She also is wearing a very thin veil over the top of everything. That's very common in married women, but in her case, it's almost a requirement. This is the other extreme example of the 1590s fashion. Notice that the point has shortened up considerably, but here's that triangle still coming from the underarm. This may be a side lace gown. It is hard to tell. There's a little bit of a seam line. It could be a gap, or it may lace on the back. It does not close in the front. This one, there are very clearly 2 layers of ruffles underneath the partlet. One may be body linen, the other one may be a corset. I'm not entirely sure, but there are very clearly 2 layers under this. There is no sleeve head, and I don't think anything other than a vestigial strap appears at the top of the sleeve. If you look very carefully, you'll see that the side of the bodice is starting to come up underneath the arm, and there may be an attachment point right there underneath. Sleeves are pieced, and the seam, they aren't trying to hide it. It's very obvious, and in some cases, they even bead and bring attention to it. In this picture, you can quite clearly see the break in the pleats right here, indicating that there is something underneath the upper edges of this. It looks like a giant pillow holding out the upper pleats. It is not a farthingale. The lower pleats are not stiff or regular. And whatever this is soft. One of the last pieces here, this one is after 1600. You can see that they're all cut beneath the bosom, and there's practically no arm strap at all. These are just sewn on, I believe. And the partlets have gotten very, very plain again, but opaque. You can see the difference between skin tones, right? And the collars aren't covered in lace anymore, but they have the figure 8 style. And here is the image that makes me think that perhaps the sleeves are sewn directly onto the partlets. It looks like you would put on a gown, put on your partlet, pull it down into the bodice, pull it snug, lace it down to keep it in place, and then pull your sleeves on and sew them to the partlet itself. So basically, the partlet is the bodice. That's what it looks like is what is happening, and that would make sense based on the extreme smallness of the shoulder line in the fashions at the turn of the century. Here we have a widow who is wearing her outside veil. You can tell that they're supposed to be completely enshrouded in these, and they're supposed to look dowdy and, excuse me, cat help, unmarriageable. But they actually took these big black things and used them in ways that only attracted, the gaze to them. They would pink the edges. They would peek out underneath them. You can see here that her collar is high up at the back with the figure 8 folds, but there's very little, if any, lace. You can see that her partlet comes down on either side, but does not cover the center of the bosom. And you can see that while her actual nipples may be covered, it's not by much. Here we have a ball scene of the same time frame in the early 1600s. You can see that the arms are still very slim. There's very little interest at the actual shoulder. It's become almost as the partlets have turned into another piece of clothing. They're now purely fabric, and now it's just a different piece that this is attached to. The figure eight becomes the standard pleating, and you can see quite clearly that there's a significant rise on the back side and in the upper areas of the skirt. Something is holding them out, but it could be something related to the petticoat layer, or it may be an additional item such as a bum roll underneath it. Here you can see that hair has gotten very simple and very close to the head. There are a couple of ladies wearing tiny little points here and there, but by and large, the focus in the head area has gone to the actual collar itself rather than to the hairstyle. Bodices are still cut below the bust, and the partlet itself covers the actual bust. And that is all I have, at least at this time. I hope this has been informative. I hope it wasn't too informative. And I would love to see any projects anyone makes of Venetian clothing, because the more Venetians we have, the better. And with that, I will give you back to Raffaella. Thank you very much for your time.
So if anyone has any questions, if there's anything anyone would like to go over, as we end the recording, I believe we're still going to have some time for question and answer. So if you want to go back over anything, let us know. I also tend to have a lot of bits of information that may be useful or useless, depending on your perspective, about different aspects of Venetian fashion. Things like the coral necklaces that you've seen a couple of the small children wear. Those were actually used also for teething infants. Coral was considered to be good luck, among other things. So please continue to join us if you have any questions, and we can dive right in. Thank you. And thank you for joining us today.